When we talk about mood-heavy action adventures, there are always a handful of games that stand out because they don't just try to tell a story, they try to make you feel the story in every move you make. Unbroken is one of those. It's not just another revenge tale, though the premise might sound familiar at first. You're chasing a traitor named Nielsen across a fractured realm called Crests Edge. But this isn't a straight line. Point A to point B pursuit, it's a Grindhouse-inspired descent into chaos where the path twists depending on the choices you make, the factions you align with, and the way you carve your way through the kingdom. The first thing that makes Unbroken different is its atmosphere. You're not dropped into a shiny world of heroes and villains. It's a place scarred by rebellion, corruption, and class divides so sharp, you'll feel them in every corner you pass through. The lowest districts cling to medieval dirt and wood, while the wealthier regions climb towards something closer to Victorian industrial sprawl. It's not just a visual distinction, it seeps into how people talk to you, how they treat you, and what options you have available. The social structure is baked into the gameplay itself, so your journey upward doesn't just mean stronger enemies and tougher environments, it means stepping into new cultures and customs as you ascend. Now, combat here isn't about grinding out the same repetitive slash until the screen's clear. Unbroken leans into a Tarantino-esque vibe, with sudden bursts of brutal, stylish violence that are almost balletic in the way you can string attacks together. It's visceral, it's messy, and it's meant to feel that way. The game uses what's called the punch-through system. Every shot you fire leaves volumetric blood sprays, ripping clean through targets in a way that's designed to be as visually impactful as it is satisfying. And then there's the resin, a set of oils that grant you bullet time abilities. The resins aren't gimmicks, they're tactical choices. Use them wisely, and you'll slow the world down, unleash devastating combos, or even weaponize the environment like sending inanimate objects flying as if they were cannon fire. They add variety, but more importantly, they make every fight feel dangerous, because using them poorly can turn the tide against you just as fast. Where Unbroken really stands out, though, is in how time moves. You don't just wander aimlessly until the plot remembers you. The game runs on a progressing timeline. Festivals happen, rebellions unfold, power struggles shift, all while you're out there hunting Nielsen. You've got 5 moons to complete your quest. That ticking clock creates pressure, but it also makes the world feel alive. If you take too long or ignore certain events, things don't just wait for you. They change. And with multiple endings on the table, every choice feeds into how your story closes. Do you bring Nielsen back alive? Do you abandon the chase? Or do you get swallowed by the chaos before you even reach him? Visually, Unbroken is fascinating because it walks the line between nostalgia and modern fidelity. The developers describe it as a next-gen reimagining of those classic sprite-based first-person games from the 90s. Things like Tech War, Disruptor on the PlayStation 1, or Witchhaven. But instead of just recreating pixels, they ask, how do we remember those games? Through rose-tinted glasses? That memory becomes the blueprint. So you still get the retro sprite aesthetic, but it's upgraded with modern shaders, advanced lighting, ragdoll physics, and destructible environments. It's a clash of old and new, which mirrors the classism woven into the lore. You're looking at something that feels familiar yet alien, brutal yet stylish, grimy but also theatrical. And then there's the soundtrack. Roland Redwood, who worked on titles like Sinless and Neckbreak, is behind the score here. And instead of a predictable fantasy soundtrack, what you get is a dynamic jazz punk composition that matches the chaos. It's off-kilter, it's stylish, and it keeps the world from feeling like just another dark fantasy setting. When you're stringing together combos and blood spraying across destructible walls, the music doesn't just accompany it, it drives it, keeping every encounter pulsing with energy. The way Unbroken presents its world means that even when you're not fighting, there's something to absorb. Walking through the townships, you'll see how architecture shifts with the social ladder. The language changes, the fashion changes, the technologies change. And because events unfold with or without you, you feel less like a player dropped into a sandbox and more like a stranger moving through a place that exists whether you're there or not. That sense of immersion is hard to pull off. But when it works, it's the difference between a good action game and a memorable one. Of course, everything comes back to that oath. You're here to find Nielsen. The game reminds you of it constantly, in whispers, in lore, even in the prayer that bookends the journey. I will pray day and night for your safe return. It's a thread of solemnity that cuts through the grindhouse violence. Because yes, you'll splatter enemies against walls in a flash of red, but in the end, this is still a story about loyalty, betrayal, and the weight of your word. So what do we have in Unbroken? A blend of old-school shooter DNA with modern design philosophy, a grindhouse aesthetic fused with evolving, class-divided lore, combat that's as flashy as it is lethal, music that grooves where you don't expect it, and a timeline that refuses to wait for you to catch up. It's the kind of game that doesn't just hand you a quest and a map, it hands you a living, bleeding world and tells you the clock is ticking. What you do with that time, and what kind of justice you choose to serve, is entirely in your hands.
Kill the foreigner! Reloading! As long as he keeps his distance, stinking posh bastard. Stay away!